Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Patriots History. I'm Larry Swikart, co-author of Patriots History of the United States with Michael Allen. Now in its 41st printing, I've got to get an update. I'm pretty sure we're ahead of 41st printing, but I'll find out on that. So I am using the 15th anniversary edition. If you're using an earlier edition, the pages may not line up. Even if you go back too far, the headers won't line up. So just be apprised that if you're using a different edition, you may have to hunt and peck around to figure out where we are. We're currently in Chapter 10, Ideals and Realities of Reconstruction, under the header War on Four Fronts, and I am on page 390 at the third full paragraph beginning, meanwhile. So you can take some time and find that. Meanwhile, if you're not aware, I have a full curriculum in U.S. and world history for high schoolers. I've had 8th graders do the course. I even had one 7th grader do it. I don't recommend it for 7th or 8th graders, but they have done it. So the full course has lessons for every single chapter in Patriots history. They're tied to the headers. I walk you right through the book with the prompts. The teacher's guide give you the answers to the prompts. The student workbooks have places to write. I have tests with answer keys. I test about every 2 to 3 chapters, not every chapter. And then, of course, the highlight is that I have videos that go with every single chapter. The videos are 45 minutes to an hour each. I teach it all in high production with maps, charts, graphs, images behind me. All of those are downloadable. There's no license to expire. Use it with as many kids as you want. Now, I have a lot of people asking me, well, I have a co-op or I'm using it with a school. We have no way of, policing that. I would say, do us a favor, if you're using it with a co-op, please get a new curriculum for every 5 students that you add. So if you got 15 students, get 3 curricula. That's only fair. Also, that way you'll get 3 different computers to put passwords on in case you want to have people looking at the videos at different times at different places. But again, we have no way of policing that. The world course is 15 units. These are both 1-year courses. World course has 7 units in the first semester, 8 in the second. There's a lot of reading in the second semester, which is why I recommend doing U.S. first, then world history. World history comes with 15 videos. These are longer also, an hour to an hour and 15 minutes each, because I'm dealing with bigger topics, Asia, Africa, Latin America, Russia, and so on and so forth. So check it out. You can see the try before you buy on the website. There's a sample of my video teaching for chapter 4, the U.S. book. So take a look. Okay, let's get started here. And meanwhile, from March to June 1866, the Joint Committee on Reconstruction held its hearings, substantially biased against the South, calling 77 Northerners living in the South, 57 Southerners, and a handful of freedmen. The committee listened to hours of critical testimony, quickly dismissing hostile witnesses. Northern newspapers carried the testimony, which convinced Northern voters of Southern mistreatment of blacks. When the committee delivered its report, it convinced most objective observers that despite the lopsided way in which the committee gathered the evidence, serious abuses of the freedmen continued. Worse, the committee concluded that, quote, a state of rebellion still existed in the South and recommended Confederate states be denied representation in Congress. With this report, Congress reasserted its authority over that of the executive to direct Reconstruction. Johnson remained set in his objections that no ratification process for the 14th Amendment could occur until the Southern states are reinstated. He encouraged the Southern governments to reject the amendment which they did. Only Tennessee ratified it. Otherwise, the South held out for the midterm 1866 elections, which it hoped would oust the hated radicals. Johnson's response to the 14th Amendment, combined with a maladroit campaign tour in late August, helped swing the election further to the radicals. His obstinacy confirmed his Southern loyalties in the minds of many Northerners, and late summer race riots in New Orleans and Memphis seemed to expose the failure of the president's program. In the fall campaign, radicals linked support of the reconstructed governments to the treason of the hated wartime Copperheads. Voters agreed and sent a two-thirds Republican majority to each house, with more radicals than ever filling the number. Congress had finally gained ascendancy over Reconstruction policy. With Johnson essentially neutered, Congress proceeded to act upon the Joint Committee's recommendations by passing the Military Reconstruction Act. Under this law, governments formed under presidential Reconstruction were swept away as illegitimate, and instead the South was divided into 5 military districts, each commanded by a loyal Republican general. Johnson vetoed the act of March 2nd, 1867, and Congress overrode his veto. Under the first Reconstruction Act, its very title implying that Johnson had not presided over any legitimate Reconstruction, Southern states now had to hold new constitutional conventions. Instead of the 10% rule that guided the earlier conventions, these new conventions were to be selected by universal manhood suffrage, meaning black voters had to be involved. Readmission to the Union required that the new state constitutions recognize the 14th Amendment and guarantee blacks the right to vote. Congress would sit as the sole judge of whether a state had complied. The military commanders, a la the 14th Amendment, prohibited high Confederate office holders from voting or holding office and had authority to determine what constituted a legal election. The process ensured that more blacks voted and fewer whites did. Commanders registered voters in large numbers, 703,000 blacks and 627,000 whites, and in 5 states, blacks were the majority of all voters. Remember, in the Old South, they were a 1/3 minority. Military tribunals investigated a person's loyalty, and some estimates suggest that as many as 500,000 whites were disqualified. Thus emerged the hated triumvirate of Scalawags, Carpetbaggers, and Black Republicans to put the radical Southern governments in power. Scalawags, or Southerners, so the way to remember this is Scalawags begins with an S, Southerners begins with an S, all right? Scalawags, or Southerners who chose to ally with the Republicans, acted out of a variety of motivations. The term scalawag was a folk expression for mean, lousy cattle. Many scalawags were pre-war Whigs never comfortable within the Democratic Party. Some, such as Confederate General James Longstreet, saw the Republicans as the only hope for Southerners to regain power of their states. Others included Joe Brown, the governor of Georgia, who switched parties only temporarily for financial gain, and the gray ghost, Virginia Colonel John Singleton Mosby. The term carpetbaggers referred to Northerners who came south to impose their views on Dixie. They traveled with their suitcases or carpet bags. So scalawags, Southerners, carpetbaggers, Northerners. They were scorned by Southerners as do-gooders. Some, if not most, were well-intentioned teachers, missionaries, doctors, and administrators who flocked to the South to assist both the freedmen and the devastated white communities. But more than a few were arrogant and impulsive, caring little for the traditions they crushed or the delicate social tensions that remained. Got to always look out for do-gooders. They always supposedly mean well, but they always bring as many problems as they solve. The third leg of Reconstruction tripod, the Black Republicans, were also hated by all but a few progressive Southerners. At best, Southerners saw free blacks as pawns of the Republicans, and at worst, a threat to the social order. Nevertheless, for the first time under these Reconstruction governments, African Americans won seats in the U.S. government. Black Reconstruction, as Southerners called it, put a number of freedmen in positions of power. Between 1869 and 1901, there were 2 black U.S. senators and 16 congressmen elected. Like many of his colleagues, Blanche Kelso Bruce, 1841 to 1898, U.S. Senator from Mississippi, was highly qualified. Born into slavery in Virginia, Bruce was tutored by his master's son and worked as a printer's apprentice. When the Civil War started, he escaped north, and after the Union Army rejected his attempt to enlist, he taught school, attended Oberlin College in Ohio, and worked as a steamboat porter. After the war, Bruce moved to Mississippi, where he became a prosperous landowner and served in a low-level elected offices. Serving as a sheriff of Bolivar County, he gained the favor of Republicans at Jackson, and after a few high-profile appointments, was elected to the Senate by the Mississippi legislature in 1874. Bruce fought against the Chinese Exclusion Act, spoke in favor of Indian rights, and became the first African-American to chair a Senate committee. Once the Redeemer Democrats regained power, they ousted him, but Bruce had so impressed the National Republicans that he received a handful of votes for vice president in 1880. Another black U.S. Senator, Hiram Revels, was a free man in North Carolina before attending school in the North. Ordained a minister by the African Methodist Church, Revels headed congregations in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, and Kansas before moving to Maryland. After April 1861, he worked for the Union cause in Maryland by organizing black regiments and then recruited African Americans to serve in Missouri. Like Bruce, he settled in Mississippi after the war and held local alderman positions, then state senator positions in Adams County before the Mississippi legislature named him to fill Jefferson Davis's seat. That's not ironic. His appointment actually preceded Bruce's, though it was much shorter, lasting only until the end of 1871, when he returned to assume the presidency of Alcorn College, Mississippi's first black university. Bruce, Revels, and other African Americans elected during Black Reconstruction, regardless of their qualifications, only stayed in office by the good graces of the Republican governments, I should add, and also the military. More precisely, they could only hold office so long as the military allowed them to. The presence of black elected officials exaggerated the perception that the radical governments ruled only through force. Increasingly, there was a real awareness that some were horribly corrupt. Their legislatures issued bonds for any project, no matter how financially unstable. Virtually all the governors accepted bribes to grant charters or franchises. Governor Henry Warmoth in Louisiana, for example, reputedly stashed away a cool $100,000 from public works contracts. Alabama printed $18 to $20 million worth of railroad bonds, and the overall debt of the 11 former Confederate states was estimated to exceed $132 million by 1872, yet with no tangible results for the expenditures. Printing costs mysteriously soared. In South Carolina, the cost of state printing from 1868 to 1876 surpassed the total state expenses for printing from the entire period from 1879 to 1868. Sounds like the Tweed Ring, doesn't it? Remember that section? Legislators put in requests for supplies such as perfume, hams, ladies' bonnets, and champagne, all obviously essential to passing good laws. Reconstruction governments thus featured a disturbing mix of Northern reformers, Southern opportunists, and a sea of inexperienced blacks with practically no capital and little economic clout. Had all the motives of the actors been pure, the task of running the governments efficiently and without corruption would have been difficult. And without doubt, many in the Reconstruction government sincerely wanted to improve the lives of all. They introduced some of the first public schools in the South, enacted prison and asylum reforms, and enforced the 14th Amendment rights of the freedmen. Without the support of Southern whites, absent from their own economic base and lacking any political experience, the governments did what governments often do. They threw money at the problems. No transportation, issue railroad bonds that would never be paid. No education, throw up a school and assume educated blacks would somehow be respected by their former masters. It would be a mistake to assume that the radicals lacked democratic support for these measures. Even in the South, most of the railroad bond measures were bipartisan and remained so until the Panic of 1873. Only after a new group of Bourbon, that is, Redeemer Democrats, had appeared, those interested in repudiating the debts and rejecting state aid to railroad projects, did support for those measures dry up. Moreover, concern over graft and government excess grew to the point that when Bourbons took the scene in 1870, they found voters receptive to reducing the size of government and lowering taxes. As these trends unfolded in the South, Republicans in Washington had a veto-proof majority, although Johnson still had enforcement powers. As commander-in-chief of the Army, the only institution capable of actually putting Reconstruction policies into practice, Johnson could still control the pace of change. He also found a surprising ally in the Supreme Court, which in the Ex parte Milligan case of 1866 unanimously ruled against the imposition of martial law in cases where civil administration still functioned. This cut the legal legs out from under the military governance in the South, and the court proceeded to rule against loyalty oaths that allowed many civil suits against military governors for damages. Congress, sensing where the court was headed, used its discretionary power granted in Article 3 of the Constitution to state that the court had no jurisdiction in cases of habeas corpus, the issue that had been spawned by Milligan. Congress succeeded in evading the Constitution's stipulation that only wartime suspension of civil governments was legal. The war was over, but the court had no way to enforce its ruling. Checkmated, the court withdrew from accepting most other Reconstruction-related decisions. Now only Johnson stood between Congress and the vision of a prostate South. Concerned the president might outmaneuver them by using his constitutional power as the head of the executive branch to go directly through the officer corps and the Union Army, in February 1867, the Radicals passed the Tenure of Office Act, a measure that prohibited Johnson from removing federal office holders without Senate approval, which is unconstitutional. This act violated a 78-year-old precedent and in essence handcuffed the president from removing incompetent or even dangerous officials if they had allies in the Senate. Johnson, as expected, vetoed the measure, and Congress, as expected, overrode the veto. At the same time, Congress passed the Command of the Army Act, requiring presidential orders or orders from the Secretary of War, a radical sympathizer Stanton, to go through the General of the Army, in that case, Ulysses S. Grant. Moreover, it stipulated Grant could not be assigned to a duty in any area other than Washington, anticipating that Johnson might send him on a fact-finding mission to, say, China. In fact, Grant wanted to maintain a low profile. He didn't want any part of this. Although he seldom agreed with Johnson, Grant appreciated the separation of powers and understood the necessity for keeping the executive branch an independent, powerful check to Congress. Although his sympathies in matters of Reconstruction favored the Republicans, he nevertheless supported Johnson's orders and attempted to execute them. Johnson, convinced many of these congressional acts were unconstitutional, decided to challenge the Tenure of Office Act. He removed Stanton in August while Congress was adjourned, replacing him with Grant as Secretary of War. He sent the Senate an explanation of his reasons in a December communication, but it was too late. The Senate rejected Johnson's statement for removing Stanton by a whopping 35-6 vote, and on January 14, 1868, it was time for Grant to pick up his things and vacate the War Department office. Scarcely a month later, in February 1868, Johnson dismissed Stanton a second time and replaced him with Lorenzo Thomas. Modern readers must note that in the 19th century context of separation of powers, Congress had no constitutional right of review for executive appointment officers. In firing and hiring cabinet members, Johnson was not only fully within his constitutional rights, but he was in keeping with the actions of virtually every chief executive before him. Realistically, however, the radicals saw Johnson as an obstacle to their programs, and neither the law nor the Constitution could be allowed to get in their way. At any rate, with the Thomas appointment, a truly extraordinary scene unfolded. Stanton refused to vacate his office and had a warrant issued for Thomas's arrest. Does this sound like the Democrats today? whereas Johnson sent Thomas's name the second in a few months to the Senate for approval. This time, there was no doubt among the House Judiciary Committee members who recommended 11 articles of impeachment for, quote, high crimes and misdemeanors. 9 articles specifically related to Stanton's illegal in the eyes of the House dismissal. 1 involved Johnson's speeches, and the 11th catch-all article lumped together every charge the radicals could find. It was Thaddeus Stevens' moment of triumph, so ill that he had to have the clerk read his speech inaugurating the impeachment committee. He was nevertheless so obsessed by enmity toward Johnson that he lashed out, quote, "Unfortunate, unhappy man, behold your doom," unquote. So spiteful was Stevens' speech that the Northern press stood back aghast. The New York Herald wrote that Stevens, quote, had the bitterness and hatred of Marat, the French writer, and unscrupulousness of Robespierre, the head of the Jacobin party in France, who ended up being sent to the guillotine himself. Although many historians condemn the impeachment process as rash, reckless, and unwarranted, it is significant that the full House vote was a substantial 126 to 47. This is a ratio far higher than the House impeachment vote against Bill Clinton a century later, 228 to 206, on the key article of perjury following a sexual harassment suit brought against him. It was also much higher than either of the impeachments against President Trump. A Senate trial of Johnson soon followed. Although modern Americans are slightly more familiar with the processes of impeachment because of the Clinton case, and I would add now the Trump cases, the mechanics are nevertheless worth restating. After a full House vote in favor of the articles of impeachment, the president is officially impeached, but then must stand trial before the Senate. The impeachment is not the trial. It is basically bringing the charge, like a prosecutor brings a charge. The prosecutors of the case are House managers who present the evidence for removing the chief executive. According to the Constitution, the House and only the House determines whether the offenses constitute, quote, high crimes and misdemeanors. In other words, once the House has turned out articles of impeachment, the Senate's only constitutional function is to determine guilt or innocence. Senators cannot, at least according to the Constitution, determine that a president is guilty, yet conclude that the removal is too great a penalty. Rather, the House has already found that if the president committed the acts of which he was accused, the penalty is automatic if he's found guilty. All right, so let me explain this a little bit now. So we've had Johnson, Clinton, Trump, and Trump all impeached, and we have had none of them convicted. I'll get to the Johnson acquittal in a moment. In each case, the system did not work as was intended. In the Johnson case and in the 2 Trump cases, the House majority was so corrupt and so filled with bile and anger against the president, Johnson, Trump, that it did not do its job. It brought frivolous, stupid charges that it should not have brought. Now, it is true that Johnson violated the Tenure of Office Act. That act itself was unconstitutional. Johnson would have been better served by taking it back to the Supreme Court. But remember what happened with the Supreme Court. They just ignored it. So he was kind of caught in a quandary here. If he took it back to the court supported him, the House wouldn't obey it anyway. In the case of Trump, you had totally frivolous charges that had nothing to do with reality. In one case, a phone call to the Ukrainian president, which, as Trump correctly said, was a perfect phone call. It was really perfect. And in the second case, you had this nonsensical stuff that Trump somehow ordered protesters to invade Congress when his words to them were, quote, to peacefully and patriotically protest. Said nothing about violating the barriers of Congress. And we'll get into that in the last new chapter that I've added, which is that as you know from the video, the police there, the Capitol Police, let them in, encouraged them to come in. So I don't want to hear about it. Both those things were totally unconstitutional, irrelevant, ridiculous, flawed, fraudulent hoaxes. The one in Johnson's case was a technicality that, yes, he violated the Tenure of Office Act, but everybody in Congress knew that that was a vile, bitter attempt to keep him from doing his job. However, that said, according to the Constitution, in all 4 cases, the House had said, yes, these charges are worthy of high crimes and misdemeanors. That's what the House is supposed to do. However, the Senate is only supposed to say, did he do what he was accused of doing? Did Johnson violate the Tenure of Office Act? Did Clinton lie? Did Trump say something wrong in the phone call? Did Trump order people to invade Congress? And the answer should be, if no in any of those, then it's an acquittal. And if yes, as in the first 2, Johnson did violate the Tenure of Office Act, Clinton did lie to a grand jury, they should have been removed. But in none of these 4 cases did that happen. In all 4 cases, well, in 3 of the cases, the House Republicans in 1998 were correct that Clinton did violate the Constitution. He did engage in high crimes and misdemeanors. He engaged in obstruction of justice. He should have been removed. But in the other 3 cases, you had the Senate, the House not doing its job. You had the House not doing its job. The House took either frivolous measures or unconstitutional measures and held those up to the level of high crimes and misdemeanors. In all 4 cases, the Senate did not do its job the way it was intended. Now, I would argue in the case of Trump, it did its job correctly. In the case of Johnson, it did its job justly, but not correctly. In the case of Clinton, it did not do its job either justly or constitutionally. In other words, what we're going to see is that the Senate would not convict Johnson of high crimes and misdemeanors, even though he very clearly was guilty of violating the Tenure of Office Act. But the Senate said, well, that doesn't really rise to the level of high crimes or misdemeanors. Can't do that. It's not your constitutional job to determine that. It's the House's job. In the case of Clinton, they said, well, he clearly did this, but again, it didn't rise to the level of high crimes and misdemeanors. Not your job. It's the House's job. You had no business saying that. In the case of Trump, the Senate twice said, this doesn't rise to the level of high crimes and misdemeanors. Not your job. The House was wrong. The House was in violation of its own rules and constitutionality, but nevertheless, it wasn't the Senate's job to do that. So our constitutional system broke down all 4 times in all 4 impeachments. Now, 3 of those turned out to be the right call, the just call, if not the legal call. But the 4th one, in the case of Clinton, was neither the just call nor the constitutional call. All right, so let's look at what happened to Johnson. The structure, however, produced an unfortunate flaw in the practice, namely that since the Senate would always be the second and final body to judge a president, its members could ignore the requirement that they rule on guilt or innocence only and instead re-argue the entire question of whether the behavior fits the high crimes and misdemeanors bar, which is what they did in all 4 cases. Both American impeachment trials, again, when this section was written, it was before the Trump impeachment. So all 4 impeachment trials resulted in the Senates of the respective day ignoring their constitutional charge and insinuating themselves into the powers and prerogatives of the House. When the House managers prepared their case, John A. Bingham of Ohio headed the prosecution. Formerly opposed to impeachment, Bingham had finally concluded that Johnson had to go. Radicals dominated the prosecution team and took the most extreme positions, attempting to paint Johnson as a wild-eyed dictator bent on overthrowing the government. In a remarkable display, Senator Benjamin Beast Butler waved a nightshirt allegedly stained with the blood of an Ohio carpetbagger that had been flogged by Mississippi ruffians to show the lawlessness of the South. From that point, in every election, Republicans would, quote, wave the bloody shirt, and the tactic proved effective until the mid-1880s. It was less useful for Bingham, however. Johnson's defense attorneys made eloquent speeches on the president's behalf. More important, no one could produce evidence of treason or truly criminal intent by Johnson, who had sought only to challenge a constitutional question the wrong way. All this made the moderates uneasy about the precedent of unseating a sitting president. So anyway, sorry, I had to be interrupted there. Let's start back here. When the House managers prepared their case, John A. Bingham of Ohio headed the prosecution, formerly opposed to impeachment. Bingham finally concluded Johnson had to go. Radicals dominated the prosecution team and took the most extreme positions, attempting to paint Johnson as a wild-eyed dictator bent on overthrowing the government. In a remarkable display, Senator Benjamin Beast Butler waved a nightshirt allegedly stained with the blood of an Ohio carpetbagger who'd been flogged by Mississippi ruffians to show the lawlessness of the South. From that point, in every election, Republicans would wave the bloody shirt, tactic that proved effective in the mid-1880s, but it was less useful for Bingham, however. Johnson's defense attorneys made eloquent speeches on the president's behalf. More important, no one could produce evidence of treason or truly criminal intent by Johnson, because he didn't have any. He just wanted to challenge this one law, who had sought only to challenge a constitutional question. All this made the moderates uneasy about the precedent of unseating a sitting president. When the Senate voted on the catch-all of Article 11, the total was 35 to convict and 19 not guilty, providing Johnson with a single vote margin needed to keep him in office. The Senate had voted to keep an unpopular president in office on the basis that his crimes were not sufficient to warrant his removal. The American system depended on officials being virtuous and observing the law. When a chief executive such as Andrew Johnson, who ignored the Supreme Court ruling, or Andrew Johnson, who defied Congress, chooses not to obey the law, the removal process virtually always boils down to personal popularity or individual intent. Up to the present, no president has so lacked in either of these categories as to warrant conviction. All right, so I'm going to stop there. There's a little bit more of this section, but we're going to stop there. This brought to my attention that I do need to send in a few revisions to see if we can revise on this page to get this part up to what happened with President Trump, but I've got to be able to do it so as to not screw up the page. It's kind of hard. You can do this in a new printing, but you can't do it in without a new edition if you go beyond the page. So I'll figure it out. All right. I'll see you guys back here next time here. So stay wild.